My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and for 6 years I believed I had finally found the kind of love people spend their entire lives searching for. My husband's name is Daniel. He was 40 years old when I met him, successful, kind, quiet, the kind of man who remembered small things. He knew how I liked my coffee. He knew I hated driving in heavy rain. And every night before going to sleep, he would reach for my hand. For 6 years I thought our marriage was unbreakable. Until one Monday morning, a woman walked into my husband's office and changed everything. Her name was Rebecca. She was Daniel's ex-wife, and she had been gone for 12 years. I didn't know she was coming back. I didn't know why she had returned. And I certainly didn't know that by the end of that week, I would be wondering whether my husband had ever truly loved me. It started with a phone call. Daniel was in the shower when his phone rang. I wasn't trying to look at it, but the screen lit up on the kitchen counter. There was no name, just a number. Then a message appeared. Daniel, it's Rebecca. We need to talk. I stared at the screen. Rebecca. I had heard the name before, but only once, years ago, when Daniel and I were dating. I had asked him about his previous marriage. He told me they had been married for 4 years, then divorced. He never spoke badly about her, and he never explained exactly why they separated. I never pushed. I trusted him. That morning, when Daniel came downstairs, I asked him about the message. He stopped walking. For several seconds he said nothing, then he took a breath and said, "She's back." I asked why, and he said he didn't know, that she hadn't told him. I waited, then asked the question I was afraid to ask. Did he still love her? Daniel looked almost offended and said no, that he hadn't spoken to her in 12 years. I asked if she wanted to talk to him, and he said yes. I asked if he was going to see her. He hesitated, just for a second, but I noticed. Then he said yes, because he needed to know why she was back. Something inside me became cold, but I nodded. I wanted to trust him, so I tried to. That afternoon, Daniel met Rebecca at a small restaurant downtown. I wasn't there, but when he came home I could tell something had changed. He was quiet and barely touched his dinner. Finally I asked what happened, and he said she needed help. When I asked with what, he looked down and said she was sick. I felt sorry for her, even though I didn't want to. I asked how serious it was, and he said very. Daniel told me Rebecca had been diagnosed with cancer months earlier, that she had undergone treatment, and that it hadn't worked. The doctors believed she didn't have much time left. I didn't know what to say. Then Daniel told me she didn't want anything from him, only to see him. I said okay, but it wasn't okay, not really. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca became part of our lives. Daniel visited her at the hospital, helped her with paperwork, drove her to appointments. Sometimes he wouldn't come home until midnight. Every time I asked what was happening, he said the same thing: she needs someone. I understood, but understanding didn't stop me from feeling jealous. One evening, Daniel came home carrying a small box. I asked what it was, and he sat down and told me Rebecca had given him some things. My heart sank when he opened it. Inside were old photographs. Daniel as a young man, Daniel and Rebecca at their wedding, Daniel standing beside her on a beach, Daniel laughing, a version of my husband I had never known. I picked up one photograph and told him he looked happy. He stared at it and said, "We were." I put it down and asked if he had been in love with her. He said yes. That one word hurt. He saw my face and added that it was a long time ago. I nodded and said I knew. That night, I slept facing the wall. Daniel reached for me, and I moved away. He didn't say anything. For the first time in 6 years, there was distance between us, and I was afraid, not that he would leave me, but that some part of him had never really left her. A week later, Rebecca asked to meet me. I almost said no, but I went. She was sitting by a hospital window, much thinner than I expected. When she saw me, she smiled and said, "You're Claire." I said yes. She said she had heard a lot about me. Finally I asked why she had come back. She looked outside and said she hadn't come back for Daniel. I didn't believe her, and she smiled sadly and said she didn't blame me for that. She said she had come back because she owed him the truth. I asked what truth. She took a breath and said Daniel thought she had left him because she didn't love him anymore. I asked if that wasn't true, and she said no, that she had left because she loved him. I didn't understand, so she explained. 12 years earlier, Daniel's company had been failing. He had borrowed money. His father was dying. His family was falling apart. Daniel was drowning. Rebecca had discovered she was pregnant, and she was terrified. She believed that if she stayed, Daniel would give up everything to save her and the baby. So she left, telling him she didn't love him anymore, wanting him to hate her, wanting him to rebuild his life. But something had gone wrong. She had miscarried the baby, and she never returned. I sat there in silence and asked why she hadn't told him. She said that by the time she was ready, he had moved on. Then she looked directly at me and said she needed me to know something, that Daniel had never stopped loving. My chest tightened, and I said that wasn't true. She shook her head and said he had loved her once. I said she had just told me he never stopped, and she corrected me, saying she had said he never stopped caring, that there was a difference. I didn't fully understand. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, telling me it was for Daniel, the letter she should have given him 12 years ago. I asked why she was giving it to me instead. She said she didn't think she had enough time, and that she wanted me to know she wasn't trying to take my husband. I wanted to believe her, but I was still afraid. When I got home, I put the envelope on the table. Daniel saw it and asked what it was. I told him Rebecca had given it to me. He stared at it, his face changing, and asked what she had told me. I said everything, and I told him about the baby, about why she left, about the miscarriage, about the years of silence. Daniel covered his face and cried. I had seen my husband cry before, but never like that. He said he had thought she left because he wasn't enough. I sat beside him and told him she hadn't. He asked why she never told him, and I said because she thought she was protecting him. He picked up the envelope, his hands shaking, and read the letter. I didn't read it with him. Some things belonged to the past. After he finished, he sat there for a long time, then looked at me and apologized. I asked for what, and he said for making me feel like I had to compete with someone who wasn't even here. I started crying and admitted I had been scared. He said he knew. I asked if he had been going to leave me, and he immediately shook his head and said no. I asked why he had kept seeing her, and he said because she was dying, that he couldn't abandon someone who once meant so much to him. I told him I understood. Then he said something I would never forget, that caring about her didn't mean he loved her. He said, "I love you." Those words should have made everything better, but they didn't, because Rebecca was still dying, and Daniel was still spending time with her, and I was still terrified that one day I would discover the past had become more important than our future. A few weeks later, Rebecca got worse. Daniel went to the hospital, and I went with him. She looked at both of us and smiled, saying, "You came." Daniel sat beside her and said he wouldn't stay away. She looked at me and said, "And you brought Claire?" I nodded, and she smiled and said, "Good." She reached for my hand and asked me to promise her something. When I asked what, she said, "Take care of him." I said he didn't need me to take care of him, but she smiled and said yes, he does, looking at Daniel and telling him he had always pretended to be stronger than he was. He laughed through his tears and said she hadn't changed either. For a moment, I felt like I was watching two people say goodbye to a life they once shared. Then Rebecca turned to me and said, "He loves you." I said I knew. She said no, that I didn't understand, that he had loved her when they were young, but he loved me now. That was the last conversation we ever had with her. 3 days later, Rebecca died. Daniel attended the funeral, and I stood beside him. He held my hand the entire time. After the funeral, we drove home in silence. When we arrived, Daniel sat on the couch, and I sat beside him. He looked exhausted and said he felt guilty. I asked why, and he said because part of him was sad. I held his hand and told him he was allowed to be sad. He said he loved me, and I said I knew. He said he didn't want me to think her death changed what he felt about me, and I said I didn't. He asked if I was sure, and I smiled and told him she had been part of his story, but I was his future. He pulled me close, and for the first time in months, I stopped being afraid. I finally understood something. I had spent so much time worrying that Rebecca would come back and take my husband away. But she didn't come back to take him. She came back to give him something he had been missing for 12 years, the truth. She gave him the chance to forgive her, and she gave me the chance to understand him. A few months later, Daniel and I returned to the restaurant where we had our first date. He ordered the same meal, and I ordered the same dessert. He looked at me and smiled, asking if I remembered what I had told him that night. I laughed and said no. He said I had told him I didn't believe in soulmates. I said I still didn't. He smiled and said good, because if soulmates were real, he would have to believe there was only one person meant for him, and he didn't believe that. He took my hand and said, "I believe love is a choice." He squeezed my fingers and said, "And I choose you." I smiled. Years later, I still keep one photograph from that difficult time. It's a picture of Daniel and me standing outside the hospital. Rebecca took it. We were both looking at the camera, Daniel holding my hand, and behind us was a hospital window where Rebecca was watching us. Sometimes I look at that photograph and think about how afraid I was. I thought another woman had come back to steal my husband. But I was wrong. She came back to give him back a part of himself. And maybe that's what love really is. Sometimes loving someone means holding on. Sometimes it means letting go. And sometimes it means making peace with the people who came before you, Because the past doesn't always come back to destroy your future. Sometimes it comes back to help you understand it. I thought Rebecca was the woman who had returned to take my husband away. Instead, she became the woman who taught me how deeply he could love. And when Daniel held my hand that night and told me, "I choose you," I finally believed him. Not because he had forgotten his first love, but because he remembered exactly why he chose me. And this time, there was no fear between us. Only love.